It's ad break time. I'm proud to announce that the Beyond Solitaire podcast is sponsored by Central Michigan University's Center for Learning Through Games and Simulations. 500-year-old Vampire, Jason Cox's cooperative role-playing game, is now shipping, and you should grab your copy if you haven't already. On top of that, there is new crowdfunding campaign on the horizon. In mid-January 2025, look out for Keep the Faith, a role-playing game about building a religion on BackerKit. The designer is Greg Loring Albright, who also designed Ahoy, and I'm very proud to say that I am at work on the curriculum guide, so I'm extra excited about this one. Also, if you want to support the podcast, please visit patreon.com/beyondsolitaire and help me keep the lights on. But for now, let's get on with the show. Hey, gamers, this is Liz Davis from Beyond Solitaire, and this week on the pod, I'm very happy to welcome special guest Dr. Anthony Chatfield. He is a professor at Drexel, but he is also one of the ringleaders at Board Gamers Anonymous. So how you doing today, Anthony?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. This is great.
Yeah, so I mean, I know that y'all are Board Gamers Anonymous, but we are giving you a name.
First, that's always the joke.
So tell us about the project and what its scope is.
Yeah, so there's a lot of stuff going on in our neck of the woods. So Chris and I, Chris co-founder, started Board Gamers Anonymous back in 2013. And it was a podcast, right? We just like talking about board games. We started recording it. So we've been doing that for 11 years now. And during that time, there was a lot of different opportunities to kind of stretch beyond just reviewing games and talking about the games we've been playing, which we still do. But, we started running charity events. We started running teaching events. Chris already worked in a lot of different colleges. He's a career director. And I, at the time, was working primarily in marketing, so I wasn't really privy to the workings of the academia, but it was fascinating to me. And so when we had opportunities to do presentations or teaching events or charity events, we would jump on it. So it kind of stayed like that for a long time, and then during COVID, as many people did, I decided to change what I do for a living. And just like, I don't like the marketing stuff. All my clients are on hiatus. Why don't I go back to school and get my degree so I can teach? Right. So I've, finished that during COVID, and coming out of that, had the opportunity to start teaching in composition because I have writing degrees, and realized, hey, this is fun. I wonder if I could weave in gaming. And I was teaching at Drexel University, which is very much a big thing. Their thing is whole experiential education. So I hear experiential and they mean like in the workforce, but I'm like, board games. that's what I hear. Let's experience stuff at the table. And so that was kind of just me on my own side doing my thing. And based on that, it's like, oh, we're both working in higher ed now. And we have these other friends who work in higher ed, and we're all using games in these different ways. Why don't we do something with that? So about 2 years ago, we started developing Board Game Academics, which is, it's under Board Gamers Anonymous, but it's its own thing, focused primarily, like off the bat, the goal was to launch an academic journal, which we did last year. So we held our first conference at Gen Con Trade Day in 2023, and we launched the journal early 2024, like end of February, with 10 different articles from professionals and academics throughout a variety of fields. It's cross-disciplinary. And it was a huge success. We thought it would be successful, but because it was so much work, right? Like, you put this much work into anything, it better be successful. But at the same time, it was, we were learning along the way, all of us having worked on papers, submitted papers. I'd worked on literary journals, but like this was, kind of a new endeavor to kind of explore this space. But we saw an opportunity, right? Like, there are some journals out there that cater to, the use of board games in various academic settings. Like, we didn't reinvent the wheel or anything, but we wanted to look at it from a perspective that was more I guess, practical. Like, theory is great, and theory is a huge part of it, and some of our authors definitely focused on that. But like, let's kind of put the focus on papers and researchers who are new in the field, bringing great ideas, and then like, what is the application of their research, right? So, if they're teaching a class, how did they design and develop that class, and then how did it go, right? And so that's been fantastic for us. We have a bunch of new, right now we're in the middle of peer review for issue 2. I just literally this morning sent all those emails out. So that's always fun. um, and we're preparing for several other new initiatives that we're kind of working our way into here towards the end of the year. Um, so yeah, lots of good stuff.
Excellent. That's really exciting. Yeah, I was looking up, our initial contact was in 2020 and 2021, and I don't feel like
Right. Yeah.
any of this stuff was happening at the time. Was that going on behind the scenes already, or did we just do, like, a fun board game draft and then now things have just developed since then?
Yeah, no, I mean, the podcast had been going for years before that, but it was just, a thing we did. It was, and honestly, for a long time, it was just like, this is a way for us to stay connected as friends because I was living in Pittsburgh and Chris lives in
Yeah.
Staten Island, so like we couldn't see each other very often. And so we would do the podcast every week and then meet up at 2 or 3 conventions a year and go meet with all the publishers and do our media thing. And that was pretty much it. um, During COVID, we had a bunch of little projects. We ran a Twitch stream for a few months in partnership with Board Game Arena. That was fun. We had a bunch of guests on the podcast because it was a good opportunity. Everybody was home, so
Yeah.
often
Yeah,
I'm sure
mine
you know this.
started
Like,
during.
yeah, right, like, and you know this. Like, you like, oh, that'd be a cool person to have on the podcast, and you play schedule hockey for like 3 weeks. But during COVID, it was so easy. Like, you free? Yeah, of course I'm free. So we had a bunch of people on, and yeah, the academic stuff kind of came after the fact.
That's super interesting. I've had a lot of academics who work on video games on here,
Mm,
and I feel like video games as a centerpiece for academic study, I feel like that's come further than board
mm.
games. Is that a perception that you share? And how has the landscape been evolving since you started dipping your toes in?
Yeah, yeah. So I would say definitely, right. Like, doing my own research when I was writing, my thesis. Just going into the pedagogical stuff. I found a lot more stuff about the use of video games in the classroom than board games. And the board game stuff was often very specific. It was very specific populations or very specific case studies, and often in the context of video games, right? So, and it's not a bad thing because a lot of the stuff carries over. So, we have all these different discussions about um, different types of rhetoric, procedural rhetoric, and stuff. Like Ian Boga's talking about like how we can have conversations and how rhetoric develops through play. But really, he was writing about video games. And so I've used that. I know other people have used that to apply to tabletop games, but we didn't really have the same language structure because we're borrowing from this other language structure. Um, so, I know at least in my own writing, it's a lot of like, here's all the ideas that we have, and a lot of them are digital in nature. How can we reframe them for what we're doing here? Because it is different, right? Like, a video game exists, it's procedural because the system is procedural. There's, it's programmed to do a certain thing and it responds to the player and then it develops based on that. The board game is not, it's programmed to facilitate a social interaction, and then the social interaction develops the rhetoric. So how do we approach that? It's different. And like, that's kind of how I designed my class that I teach at Drexel, which it's using board games as a text in a writing classroom. Is how does that experience at the table with each other create a rhetorical situation in the same way as like reading a book or watching a movie would on your own? And I ask the students to compare it to video games too, because a lot of the language is the same. But it's one of the reasons we wanted to start this journal too, because we were looking at all the stuff out there. And I know from my perspective, when I pitched this class, I had to write this big long paper to kind of justify its existence and be like, no, there's research that shows that this can work. And I believe there's a benefit to having students sit in class and play board games. And it had to dig pretty deep on that. And so I know a lot of the other people on our board kind of had similar experiences of like, okay, we got to find the papers that support what I'm trying to do so I can bring it to the administration and show them that this is all pedagogically sound. I'm not making stuff up, or I'm not just like wanting to spend college money on board games. Um, and so a lot of that's like, well, why don't we facilitate that research a little bit more? Like, because the stuff that's out there is good, but there's just not that much of it. And there's so much we could say. Um, so it's been really fascinating to see the different angles people take, the different pitches we get, the different discussions we have. Not even necessarily just with the authors in our journal, but just in general, like people who are doing this research, because a lot of people are thinking about it, but they're not necessarily writing about it. So we want to like push them to write about it because we need more of it.
Makes sense. So, okay, um, how do you go from talking about something that's almost anecdotal, like this works well in my class, I
Mm.
tried this with students and they loved it? How do you turn experience and experimentation, which is what I think a lot of teachers just naturally do, into research that's actually backed up by something? How does experience become data in these kinds of contexts?
Yeah, I guess that's always a challenge, because like from my perspective, it's definitely like it's a case study, right? I teach this class once a year, maybe a couple sections. I don't have a ton of data. Um, I make changes between it based on my observations, and it evolves. But at the end of the day, it's like, here's how I framed it, and here's what I thought would happen. Here's what happened, and here's how I've learned from that, and here's all the academic backing to support that. I think what we're trying to do to, I guess, maybe better facilitate a more robust conversation is just find other people who are doing the same thing, so we can have these conversations with each other. Because I without a you know frequently what we find is these people are doing this on their own in isolation. Maybe they found one or two other people who are doing something similar, and then they meet each other like at the conferences or online in our meetups, and they're like, oh, you're doing the same thing I'm doing, but you went this way and I went this way, and maybe let's get together and see how that comes, how we can combine that. um we've had a few people as well doing more empirical research, like on larger cohorts of people, in more traditional studies, which is great. So it's something that I personally have not done at the time for, but I love to see it, because the one thing we need, I think, if we want to, because board games have so much potential benefit, especially in this current state of our educational system. Like, kids are so disconnected, they're so online, classes are so disconnected online, colleges are struggling to show people why they need to be on campus. Like, we need more things like this that show that being with other people is important as part of the educational process. Like, my class doesn't work if people don't show up in class. It just doesn't. And I know I've talked to a lot of other people who have a similar approach where, like, yeah, if you don't come and play the game, it's not, you can't just play a game at home. That's not the same thing. You need to be with the other people that you're working in a group with to write about it. Um, it doesn't work. So it creates a different dynamic. It creates a different structure. Um, how we pull the data out of that, it's kind of an evolving process as we, gather people together and figure out, what they're doing. I think step one, and then step two is how can we better, you know, uh, present that in a way that's going to be helpful to other people.
Right. So for your own class, you're in the English department,
Yeah.
and you're working on narrative. I find it very interesting that you talk about kind of board games providing rhetorical experiences. I kind of feel like people like to say that board games are a different kind of media that does something very different from what a book does, but it sounds like you want to compare the two. So where are you going with this in your class, and how are you leading students there?
Yeah. It's funny. Like, the knee jerk reaction is that it's different, right? And I think some people want to hear that. They're like, "This is different, and we're doing something cool and different and hip," right? Um, I I pitch it differently for my students, mostly to make them more comfortable. Because what ends up happening is, technically they know what they're signing up for, but they don't really know what they're signing up for. They're like, I have to take this English 103 class. This is the time I'm available. I'm going to show up, right? So probably 70% of the students who show up in this class don't know what it is. And so, like, the 30% who do are very excited. We're going to play games. It's going to be great. But the rest of them they're coming in just expecting another writing class. And so I need to pitch it in a way that it's familiar to them, and then they can put it in a framework that makes sense. So it's really about the scaffolding more than anything. Of if I say this is a completely different experience and we're thinking about communication in a completely different way, they get really overwhelmed very quickly. Um, and people are like, well, I don't know. I don't know anything about games. I don't understand how to write about experiences. That's not what I do. The way I like to frame it is, you're already reflecting on your experience in college. That's what you did in 101 and 102. You're already reflecting on things you've read. You're reflecting on how you've interacted with each other in your group projects, in the peer review, all that stuff. This is just that, but with a different kind of text. And this type of text still has an author. It still has a purpose, right? It still has, constraints to it. They're just a different type of constraints. So the rhetorical situation still exists. And with that, I'm able to kind of extrapolate a little bit and explain to them, or hopefully show them, this applies to everything, right? Any interaction you have with anybody is a rhetorical situation and can be comparable to the things that you're writing about. And part of that is just the constant question of, I teach a compulsory class to a lot of like engineering students and nursing students who don't want to be there. So how is this relevant to their lives? It's like, well, they're going to be communicating in some form, right? But it's not going to be writing necessarily. Very few of these kids are going to grow up and be academics like us. So how can I make it relevant to them? Let's put it in a framework that's fun and then show how that transfers to other things. And so kind of the bridge to that is, yeah, it's just like reading a book, except it's not like reading a book at all. Like, which we get to in like week 6 or 7, where they're like, oh, it's not the same, but it is the same, just like everything else.
So what kinds of games do you like to bring in to create these kind of experiences for students? What do you find works best?
Right. So we've actually done a lot of research as a group on this. Like myself, I have like a huge list that I've worked up. But we also did drawing from other people. We're building a library that we're going to be publishing sometime next year, just based on like firsthand case study experiences people have. But the thing that I found, and that generally seems to be the case for a lot of people, is it can't be necessarily a quote unquote gateway game. In surveying my students, I always survey them on the first day. The feedback I get is nobody's played anything more complex than Monopoly. It's very occasionally, maybe 10-20% of students have played like Catan or Ticket to Ride, right? I had one student once in 4 years of doing this who had played something significantly more complicated. I was very surprised. And I was like, well, good for you. You're going to have fun. We're probably going to play some lighter stuff than that. So the first time I taught the class, it had a lot of challenges. There's things like this rule book's a little too complex. This game has 2 or 3 mechanics in it, even though it's simple, but that's too many mechanics. So I need games that have to play in under an hour, because you have to play them during the class session. B, that are not too competitive, because you never really know where people are coming from. And you don't want to create tense situations, which has happened. And 3, it kind of needs to be as simple as possible at the level they're at within the class at that time. So like the games in week 1 are party games that anybody can play and I can teach in 5 minutes. We get to week 2, they're like single mechanic games. We look at things that you're just doing a thing, right? So like games like Point Salad or No Thanks, like simple little card games that they could play 2 or 3 times and get to know and not have to think about multiple things at a time. So I remember I brought in The Crew one year, and that broke people's brains because it's trick taking, but also co-op. It's too much. King of Tokyo was fine, but not if I put in the power-up cards, because that was too much to keep track of. And it's not that they can't do it. These are smart kids, obviously. It's just that they've never done it. So it's the same as anything else. Like we have to scaffold in the information. And by the end of this term, there are playing more complex games. The inflection point, though, in my class every time is around 4 or 5 weeks in, when we shift to cooperative games. So I don't want to start with them, because again, I want them to like get into a comfort level of things they understand. Like it's competitive, we're rolling dice, we're moving things around. But when we throw the cooperative games in the mix, almost none of them have ever played a cooperative game, like at all. So it's
Ooh.
new. Yeah, and I wouldn't expect it, but at the same time, it's such a new thing that a lot of them, I don't know, it's just not something that they're exposed to yet. Um, and early on, I was wary of bringing in pandemic just because the pandemic had just ended, not even really ended; it was still going on. Um, it turns out though that is the best game for a classroom setting. It's they work together. They kind of fumble through the rules together. If they make a mistake, it's fine. They did it together. It's challenging, but not too challenging. We can adjust the difficulty. It takes less than an hour. Um, they're all very fascinated by the theming of the game. So I don't make them all play it because there are some who just don't want to deal with that theme, which I respect. Uh, and for them, I have Forbidden Island, but that's been a really effective game in general. So, or last year, Matt Leacock joined us in one of my sessions, and the students were like really excited in a way I didn't expect. I was like, "This will be cool. He'll be there," and they were just as excited as I was. I'm like, "Oh, weird. That's cool. I'm glad you
Oh,
like the game."
that's so cute. All right, so I have a bunch of questions that kind of come back around. So, what kind of what kind of classroom assignments or writing or reading exercises go alongside something like No Thanks or like those one mechanism games or a party game? Like, how do you tie like you're playing these games and learning the English class?
Yeah, it's a good question. The So each week, the way I've structured this, and kind of developed it over time is each week they're going to play at least one game in class, and they might play other stuff outside of class. They're going to have to at some point. They have a group project they have to play outside of class. Drexel has this wonderful board game cafe, like just below the English
What?
department. Yeah, it's
Oh
great.
god.
So I send them there. I don't tell them they have to go there, but I'm like, you just go there, they'll teach you something. So one year, a group played Mysterium and came in and taught the class how to play Mysterium, which was cool. Um, but the way that we write about things is every week they have to do a gameplay journal. This is their homework, their only homework, and the journal will reflect. It's two parts. The first part is observation, so they need to tell me what happened in the game. It's pretty simple, just reflective observation, like who won, did anybody get upset, were the rules difficult, like what happened. 300 words, tell me what happened. The only rule for that response is don't tell me the rules to the game. That's not telling me what happened. Knee-jerk reactions, they always want to just tell you the rules. uh, the second half of that journal is some kind of prompt related to the game types that they played. So not everybody plays the same game every week, so I try to base the questions on the theme for that week. um, so the first week, for example, we're playing party games. I asked them about the magic circle and this idea of like joining into a communal activity and not being the cool kid in the back who won't participate, right? Um, so what does that look like? Did it break at any point? Like if you're playing Telestrations, did somebody at some point just kind of break the game? How? What happened if they did? If you're playing just one, did you really follow the rule of just one, or does somebody say, I don't know, whatever? Um, and so like I asked them to dig into that a little bit more. Like, why did that happen? How did that affect everybody? What does that experience look like? Um, and so right off the bat in week one, they're like, oh, I can write about a board game. Like I wrote 2 pages about this silly party game we played for half an hour. Um, and then from there, it's just, the prompts just depend on the week. So like in week 2, they read a little bit of Booth's book on, um, we talk about rhetoric and play and stuff like that. So they talk, the first question I ask is what decisions did the author of the game make that impacted the players, right? Like what is the game doing that affects you personally, which presumably none of them have ever thought about. Like, you know, they've all played Monopoly. At some point, we talk about Monopoly, and they're all very excited to learn about the history of Monopoly. But then they're mad about it because it's not a great
Yeah.
history. So, like, what decisions did the author make, and then what decisions did the author who stole it make, and then how can we compare those, right? Like, so it makes for interesting discussions. So yeah, I had a student write a really interesting paper, like 5 pages, about a fake artist goes to New York and the act of lying and deception in games and life, and like she tied it all together, and it was really good.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So, are they doing anything that's like a traditional English class thing in this class, or is it truly games focused the whole time?
Yeah, it's games focused. They do all the writing they need to do, right? So they have 3 major writing assignments. They have weekly homework. They have a group project they have to go do. So they write 3 papers for me. They do a portfolio at the end of everything. So I think a lot of them are surprised how much reading and writing there is. So I'm like, no, it's still an English class. You have to earn these 3 credits, but you just get to play games in class. That's all. uh, it's and that's, I think, the balance, and one of the challenges I've seen from other people I've talked to who've tried to do this is, how much reading do we do? How much of this do we do? Like, I do video lectures instead of lecturing in class. I just record like a 30-minute lecture on
It's
Loom,
like a
and I send it.
flipped classroom kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. So it might be like 30, 35 minutes on like the magic circle. Here's examples. Here's the reading, etc. Watch this before class. In class, we're going to play a game. You're going to write about how the game reflects the thing in the video. Which, honestly, if I did that in 101, I don't think anybody would watch the video. But in this class, they do. And it's great because they're like, I want to play the game, but I need to watch the video because he told me to watch the video. So it's like half their homework.
That's funny. So I'm also just curious about this in the sense of like, how does your administration feel about the way this particular class is constructed? Because I never took an English class that was anything like this. Did you have to justify, it as an English class? Did you meet with any skepticism? And then how have the results like borne out year to year?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I'm really lucky. Drexel seems to. I don't know if it's a combination of like they're really open to different ideas and approaches, or they're just not paying attention. I don't know, some combination of those two things. So like when I designed the class, it was for another class I was taking on writing theory and pedagogy. It was just the thing I needed to graduate. So I designed the class, and then they scheduled me to teach it in the spring. And it took a while to know for sure if that had been approved or where it went. But like the syllabus got put up the chain. Somebody checked the box somewhere. I never really had a conversation. The class has been observed a couple times, and I've gotten positive feedback on student engagement. My attendance is extremely high, which is good. My evaluations are very good. Like, the students enjoy the class, which I think is important, but it is academically rigorous as well. Like, they do write a fair amount. It's on par, maybe slightly more than I give them the first term when they're incoming freshmen. And it's a lot more work at home because we spend so much time in the classroom not writing, not working. So they have to do more work outside of the classroom. And I'm always surprised. Literally every year, I'm like, oh, that worked. Oh, that worked. They did the work. They showed up. They had fun. You maybe get the one curmudgeon every now and then, but most of the time it's like, I shouldn't be surprised. I know I would have fun with this, but it's, you plow your way through 101 and 102 and you drag these students through like, you can do it, just finish the paper. And then all of a sudden they're very excited. So I think it's, and I know some people aren't that lucky. I've talked to other people who've like, I've brought this to my administration. They won't approve it. They say it's not this. It doesn't meet these requirements. So I'm like, yeah, I don't know what to say. I've let people use my paper and my justifications and my sources before, just to try to get something across the board. But I have been really lucky in that regard. So I know just saying what I did doesn't always help everybody make it happen.
So it's super interesting that I'm talking to you about this kind of in the wake of the release of that article in the Atlantic, the elite college students who can't read books. How do
Right.
you feel about? I mean, I feel like most English professors have probably seen or thought about that article because it kind of hit fever pitch. So, do you have any particular feelings about your students reading and writing? And how do you feel about your class in relation to either adapting to sort of a lack of long form reading or remedying the issue by enticing it? Because I'm not sure what you're doing with that.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. It's funny. I think part of the class was a reaction to my experience of this. Like, and it wasn't even like reading. It was just like, how do I engage them more? Right.
Yeah.
I wanted to teach for a very long time, and it just wasn't the career I was in. And then when I finally got into the space, I was like, this is great. This is exciting, but it was kind of discouraging too when you show up to class and maybe 5 or 6 of them have read the reading for the day, and the rest just kind of stare at you blankly. Like, cool. All right, well, I'm going to talk at y'all. If you have anything to say, let me know. I'll just make a note that nobody did the reading. But it just becomes very transactional. Like, okay, you didn't do it, no participation points today. And it's fine. That's the system, but it's not. I don't think the punitive nature of that helps them much. It's not going to
Yeah.
encourage them, that's for sure. So I was trying to think of a way, like, how do I improve engagement? Not necessarily make them read, but like, how do I improve engagement? I want them to show up to class and have done what I asked them to do most of the time. And so, me being a board game person with a board game company and a board game podcast, I was like, board games? I don't know. I have a colleague who takes her students on tours of the city to look at murals and has a similar results because it's just they're getting out of the class, they're doing something different. Um, but at the same time, I was like, well, I don't want to like abandon the actual reading and writing part because A, probably they won't let me teach this class, but B, I don't want this to be like the easy A, the skate class, right? Like we all took that in undergrad. Like I remember my dinosaurs class. Like I get my easy 3 credits
Yeah.
for science.
I took biological toxins and poisons. I really enjoyed it actually, but
Oh, that's fun. Yeah. Those classes are a lot of fun. It's just they're easy too.
yeah.
um so it was for me, it was like I wanted to do both. And so there is a lot of reading. That again, they read probably half of Booth's book, just in snippets. Maybe not half, but good chunks of it in snippets. They read several different articles from across different things. They read some Huizinga just to get the basics in place. And I don't want to say everybody's reading everything because I don't think they are, but they read a lot of it, more than I'm used to, which is good. Um, so I don't know that necessarily, like, I don't want to be that person who's like, well, if you wrap it all in sugar and sprinkle some extra cocoa on there, they might eat it, the medicine in there, because I don't know if that's necessarily true. But I do feel strongly about meeting them where they are and like what they're interested in and what's relevant to them in their lives. And so assigning, some literature that was written hundreds of years ago that doesn't really relate to who they are or what they're doing or where they're going, while probably an important cultural lesson, isn't really going to help them learn to engage with reading and writing in a better way. So I I find it, I don't know. I want to engage them. I also want to make it relevant to what they're doing. They're especially at Drexel. They all know where they're going. Hopefully,
Yeah.
they have majors coming in as freshmen. They're on a path. So, a computer science major who's like, I don't care about I don't care about these old books. I just want to learn my code and go get a job. Um, so, like, how can I teach them the importance of communication in a way that's relevant to them? We can make it fun, I guess.
I guess.
Yeah.
I'm kind of kidding. So another question I've kind of been chewing on as we talk is, you mentioned party games, kind of simpler games mechanically, introducing pandemic, but games have so much, I think, emotional range and grit now, depending on what you're choosing.
Mm.
Um, are you like, what is the weight? What is the level of emotional weight that you're asking your students to engage with in games? And to what level are they playing things on controversial topics or difficult topics? Or are you avoiding that in favor of something else?
Great question. Yeah, it's so I do this kind of both ways. At the beginning of the term, I try to keep it as flat and neutral as possible. Right. Again, they don't all know what they're getting into. Some of them are nervous. Some of them are already like, I don't want to do this. Um, so I want it to be inviting. And then basically what I do every week is I give them a menu to choose from. It's like, here are 8 games. We're going to play 5 of these as a class. Choose the 3 that you most want to play, and I'll match everybody up. Right. It's a little more work for me, but it avoids somebody getting stuck playing something they're like, no, right? Absolutely not. And it forces them to do a little bit of research in advance. Right. So you have your handful of students who just don't do that, and whatever, they get to play whatever they want or whatever I want. So yeah, there are games like Pandemic, and some students are like, I would never play that in a million years. And I'm like, fair, I get it. It's been a traumatic time. And there are others who just would play anything; they don't care. When we get towards the latter half of the term, though, when I really want them to start thinking about, what games are communicating and how they're communicating it, we do delve into some deeper subject matter. Those games are tougher because we can't really necessarily play them in class. They're longer,
Right.
right? So we have a week where we look at games that address climate change, the shortest one we have is Daybreak. It's like an hour and a half. It's too long to play. But we'll maybe do like a fishbowl exercise and kind of run through a couple rounds, and they can see how the game plays, right? Like, this is how this works. This is how we're gamifying something that's challenging for us as a society. We also have a module where like I bring in games that are problematic. I mean, like, why is this game built the way it's built, right? Like, here's, brought in Mombasa, put it alongside Sky Mines one week. Or like, are these are the same games mechanically? Why does one like this and one the other one like this? And like, what are they trying to accomplish or communicate without necessarily trying to, put it in their heads?
Right.
So try to push them a little bit in that ways. I've had a bunch of papers about how terrible Secret Hitler is because students have thoughts on that, and it's one they've played. So once they start thinking about the rhetoric of the game, they're like, I know one, the most egregious one. Like, but there's other ones too that they'll dig into a little bit further. So it's interesting to see them start thinking about that. And then towards the end of the term, I asked them, like, link this to other media in your lives, right? Like, what are other things you've experienced that maybe have these colonialist, underpinnings that you've never thought of, that are influencing how you think about things in ways you never realized. Like, most of them didn't realize what Monopoly is actually doing until we talked about it. And they find that very fascinating. Even, it's a conversation I've had now a dozen times, but it's fun to see them come to that realization and then hopefully transfer that knowledge out to other things.
Do you find that your students change their understanding of board games and have maybe more respect for them as media by the end of your course? I find it really interesting when I tell people I work in board games. They are just baffled that that's something that I would choose to do.
Right.
But then, of course, once you're in it, you're in it. So how do their attitudes about what they're doing change? Does anybody think it's kind of dinky at first and then get over it, or?
Yeah, I'd say half of them are impressed. I do ask this question like explicitly at the end of the term, like, at the beginning of the term, I'm like, what have you played and what is your feeling about board games? Just as a starting point, like a survey. And at the end of the term, like, what do you think now? How has that changed? And I'd say half of them will be like, I never realized that a game or an experience could have this kind of rhetorical messaging or could impact me in this way. And the other half are like, I don't know, games are fun, I guess. Which is fine. If I get half of anybody for anything, I'm thrilled. But I think most of the time, even the ones who just shrug, there's more there because you can see it in their writing. Like, they're thinking about it in ways like the first paper to the third paper, it changes the way they're thinking and the way they're exploring things. It's when they start being able to apply rhetorical language to things that are not traditionally considered rhetorical. Like, you're not analyzing a text, you're not analyzing a speech, you're analyzing an experience that you had with other people. And then that idea, they can start thinking about that in other contexts. Like, okay, well, what about this class? This is a rhetorical experience. What about your job? What about, your meeting you have with your advisor later? Like, these are all rhetorical experiences. How can you reflect on these?
Interesting. So, I mean, honestly, you and I could probably talk about this forever, but I want to talk about your journal and conference as well while we still have some time. So, how did you go from I'm doing this in my classroom to, I guess, figuring out what you were looking for in a journal and calling for papers in a way that would get you what you wanted?
Yeah, no, it's so I give a lot of credit to Chris on that. The co-founder, Chris Carbone. He's worked in higher ed much longer than me. And I would have these conversations. Basically, what I'm telling you, I would just be saying, like, online before we started recording our regular podcast. And he's like, we should do something with this. We should start a journal. We should do something, right? Like, there's probably other people doing similar things who are teaching classes or finding ways to practically use board games in non-traditional ways. And so we had that conversation for maybe 6 months or so, off and on. And to me, honestly, I'll be perfectly honest, I was like, this seems like a lot of work. Like, and like, we're not going to get paid for that. But eventually, like, we go to conventions, we have conversations with people, we start recruiting people almost accidentally just by having these conversations, like over lunch or over a game. Like, Chris and I will talk about how we use games in our careers, and then other people are like, oh, I've done this. We met a guy, William Nation. He's a psychologist at Johns Hopkins University. He uses tabletop RPGs for therapy. So he's on our board as well. We work with him on a lot of things. And we realized like, a lot of people are doing this. We should gather this information. That would be great. And so it kind of developed from there. In terms of what we were looking for, honestly, when we first started, it was anything. So we kind of just put a very broad blast out for papers of just like, and we have our mission statement, which is about, we want to publish papers that talk about the use of analog gaming experiences in the higher education community to explore different ideas in practical ways, right? And so that's what we got. We got a bunch of stuff across the spectrum. And out of that, we saw a theme that was emerging of that practicality. Like a lot of people were just telling us, here's what I did, and here's the backing that I used to do it, similar to what I had done with my class. And we're like, oh, okay. So this is what we're building here, right? We're showing people how they can do this kind of thing, right? Because I go and I give these talks, these different conventions and conferences, the three of us do. And people ask like, well, how can I do this? And what do I need? And can I borrow your syllabus? And what can I send my administrators so they'll let me do it? And I'm like, well, if you're in college teaching, here's the stuff you have. If you're K to 12, I can't help you, but get creative. But yeah, it really just became one of those like, we're all doing this. We know it works. Let's formalize this, gather other people, publish research that's being done, and show the world that, yeah, you can use board games. They're fun, yes, but you can use them for other things, and they help people in a lot of interesting ways.
One thing I noticed with appreciation, by the way, is that your journal is just totally open, no paywall on the web, which is very different from something such as game studies. But I'm assuming that was something that was built in. But how are you, I guess, funding this work? I mean, so much of academia is just volunteer.
Yeah.
But is this something that y'all just decided to put together? And then also, I'm just purely curious, like, is this going to count as like a blind peer review? Or is it just more about getting stuff out there?
Yeah. So, yeah, we always wanted it to be open because the whole goal was to be helpful to people. And we've all worked in academia long enough that we've come across the paper we really needed for our research, and it was $250. I was like, come on. like the library doesn't have access or whatever. So we didn't want to be that, because like that's just the whole idea of putting gatekeeping this kind of information. It just didn't feel like it fit the mission of what we were doing. The result is, yeah, it's a lot of volunteer work at the moment. We've gotten some funding from organizations who are interested in what we're doing and in supporting our work, and we're pursuing additional opportunities. We have other like projects in the thinking space separate from the journal that could be sources of revenue that would not require us to put up a paywall on these articles. So we'll never do that. We just don't plan on it. But we are trying to figure out a way to keep it sustainable long term, because we enjoy what we're doing and we think it's important, but we'd also want it to be something that's not going to like burn everybody out. And at the same time, we want to be able to pay peer reviewers, and we want to be able to pay the people who volunteer their time to help us make it happen. It is peer reviewed. We just sent out the current articles for the upcoming journal that's coming out in January to peer reviewers. So it's double blinded, and yeah, this is the heavy part right here. I'm the editor, so I get to manage all the stuff coming and going, and all the peer review and all the feedback and the questions from the authors. And like, do I really have to do this? I'm like, I mean, yes or no, I don't know. But then the committee's going to decide whether to approve the article or not. I don't know. But yeah, it's a growing and evolving thing. We're coming to the end of our second year doing this, and we're hoping for a lot more things next year for sure.
Yeah. I always wonder about these things, just because I feel like my output would be really different if I were still in academia, because of the need for publications to count in a certain way and be reviewed a certain way. It's why CMU sponsors this podcast, to get the word out about an academic game press. Would you say that I guess, journals about board games specifically are on the rise? Because I can think of y'all's stuff like game studies, analog game studies, like
we've counted 4. I don't know if it's on the rise. I think we're the newest
you
to
might
the
be the rise.
table. Yeah, we might be the rise. I hope so. I think it's great. Yeah, the more the better. I think the thing about it too, from our perspective at least, is the more that's out there, the more people are publishing, the more people look at that and say, "Oh, that's a viable route for
Right.
research to be done." It doesn't seem as niche if it's not just like one publication. Like I know when I was doing my research, I struggled a lot to find any articles, and I only found the 2 journals that were relevant to what I was doing, and they had sparingly few articles that were relevant to what I was trying to research. So I was digging into journals that had nothing to do with tabletop games, and just hope a lot of stuff in informatics and video game and digital journals. So it we want to legitimize it, I guess, to some degree, but I don't know, maybe sounds a little bit too like we're not to that level that we can legitimize anything necessarily, but just the
Yeah,
more people doing it, I think the better.
absolutely. So, what kind of interest have you received so far? And then have you seen a jump from last year to this one in terms of people wanting to participate?
Yeah, it's been great. We were very pleasantly surprised in our first call for papers. The number of people who responded and the feedback we had. We published a great first journal, and so both times around we've done a conference in advance, and then kind of the journal after the fact, a few months later. And we had our conference over the summer this last year in New Jersey, and it was great. We had a nice turnout of people. A lot of people that obviously all the authors were there, but you're always surprised when you bring in additional people on top of that who are just interested in the topics being discussed. So this year, we didn't have to go hunting for peer reviewers. We had a lot of volunteers lined up from the past year and a half. Like we said, we've had some funding come in. We've had our board has been growing. So it's one of those things, you started out and there's like a handful of you and you're putting it out there and you're like, well, this could crash and burn in 3 months and then we'll just move on and it's fine. And as soon as you accept those people, like, okay, we're accepting your work, we're going to work on it. You're like, oh, well, now we're committed. We have to do this, right? We've told these people that we're going to take their work in and we're going to review it. And then you're kind of walking that tightrope of like, can we get all the people we need to be able to pull this off? Is everybody going to submit their work? Is it going to be good enough to publish? And it's just every step of the way where it's been amazing to see what people are doing and the work that they're putting out there. It's really, really, really cool. So now going into the second year, and we're about to put out the call for papers for the third volume at the end of November. We're honestly expecting a lot more submissions. We had a lot more submissions for year 2, but it was kind of a short turnaround on the CFP. This time we're going to leave it up for a couple months. We're running it through like PAX and some of the end of the year events so that we can get a little more publicity. And I think it's all optimism at this point. Last year, cautious optimism, and the year before that, just terror. And now it's just like we feel good. So.
Fantastic. So we're gonna end it there on an optimistic note. I'm feeling personally like I'm really happy to hear optimism about games, gaming, and academia. But I do want to ask you, people who work in games usually play some. So what are some of your favorites, especially recently?
Oh yeah, good question. We're actually doing our top 100 list on the main podcast right now. So next week we're gonna have our top 20, and then after that top 10. So recently, I got a chance to play Andromeda's Edge, which was a lot of fun. I played it, and then the next week it jumped onto my list because I had not played it before. So that was really good. Last night I played Unconscious Mind for the first time, which was very good. Chris brought that over. So it's a game about kind of the early years of psychiatry and kind of the development of that as a science. So that was really fun. And been playing a whole bunch of the new Seven Wonders Duel with the Lord of the Rings theming because I'm a fan of both of those, and it's 30 minutes, and I can get everybody in the family to play, which, I don't have anything like amazing or deep to say about it. It's just a lot of fun.
Hey, you know what? That counts. And
Yeah,
then
I'll take
just
it.
I want to make sure we had time for this. Where can y'all be found online if people are looking for your work?
Yes, so boardgameacademics.com is our official website. So if you go there, you will find not only the first issue, which is under journal, as well as we have all the videos from both of our conferences, so you can see all the speakers from 2023 and 2024. But you'll also be able to sign up for notifications of when we put up our call for proposals for 2025. So that is going up sometime, probably the week before Thanksgiving, but soon in the next month or so. And I'll shoot an email to all of you, and anybody who's interested in submitting, or if you don't have a paper but just are interested in volunteering or peer review or just learning more, please just let us know. It's always fun to get those emails.
Amazing. Anthony, thank you so much for coming on. This has been such a fun catch up.
Yeah,
I got your
no, it's
contact.
great.
Like, I did not place you as somebody that I had like spoken with because I was like trying to think of board game academics. This has been so cool to see how Board Gamers Anonymous has grown, and also what this project just is really cool.
Yeah, no, this has been wonderful. Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, everybody, if you're looking for me, I can be found everywhere online as Beyond Solitaire. And please like, subscribe, comment, ask questions, and most of all, happy gaming.